What's going on, guys? Wei Constant here at the Revolution Watch Bar, and very proud to announce our collaboration with Nomos. Our watch is the Nomos Neomatik Tangente Update 41 Resilience, and we're going to explain to you why this watch symbolizes resilience in a second. But let's talk a little bit about Nomos first. So Nomos was created in 1990 by an entrepreneur named Roland Schwartzner. And previous to that, he was a professional photographer, clearly a watch fan, but had no professional training in watchmaking.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And he, like, the kind of smartest entrepreneurs in Germany, must have seen that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was kind of a rush to Glashutte, a sleepy town 2 hours outside of Berlin, but which was the hotbed of Saxon watchmaking, right? And what's amazing to me is that in 1991, Roland Schwartzner actually launched the very first Nomos watches, which means he actually launched his watches 3 years before even Lang & Son.
Yeah, the revival of Lange actually.
Yeah, exactly.
994. Yeah.
Just goes to show you how visionary he was. And from the very beginning, he wanted to create watches that were an extraordinary value proposition, that were incredibly robust and beautifully designed following the Bauhaus aesthetic. And what is the Bauhaus aesthetic? It is about form follows function. It was a design philosophy that emerged during the Weimar Republic, and which was created by a very famous man named Walter Gropius. And it is to this day one of the most important design philosophies about form following function. So as you can see on a Nomos watch, there's nothing superfluous, there's nothing peripheral, there's no embellishments. It's straightforward, beautiful watchmaking that is really functional.
Functional and practical, that's what they are going for, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly, so the watches started at 35 mm in diameter, and over the course of Nomos' story, it was really interesting. I think from the very beginning, it was really important to Schwartzner that he wanted to create an in-house manufacturer, right? Because it was clear that he really wanted to create his own movements, and in 2005 he did. The first was a manual wind movement called the Alpha, as you would imagine, for the first, and then subsequently an automatic movement called the Epsilon, right?
Oh, wow! I didn't actually know that as well.
Yeah, and then what was amazing is in 2014, Schwartzner went so far as to create his own escapement. So it's called the Nomos swing statement, and it's an extremely mechanically efficient escapement, which means it's over 94% efficient. It loses only just under 6% of its efficiency to sliding friction of the escapement, right? Which is really remarkable. Along the way, he's also created some pretty remarkable movements. In 2015, he created the DUW3001, which is an automatic movement with a full-size rotor with a full traversing balance bridge for the balance wheel, which means it's super stable, but it's only 3.2 mm in terms of thickness. Now, when I got super interested in Nomos was around 2018 when they created a watch called the Neomatik Tangente, which actually just means tangent, so you could just say tangent.
Tangent in English,
Yes, Update 41, which was a watch that featured all of the coolness of the original Tangent Bauhaus-inspired design, but added a really cool peripheral date to it, right?
Yeah,
so what you have in the watch is a date that goes all around the perimeter of the dial, and then you have cutouts in between the individual dates. And then you have a date indicator underneath, which is incidentally luminous, right? Which is, you can't really tell time in the dark, but I just like the idea that it adds a little bit of like kind of emotional vibrancy, right? The dial side kinetics, I like to say. And it jumps precisely at midnight to occupy the apertures on either side of whatever date you're in. Now, what's really cool about this is that it actually can go backwards and forwards as well.
It's a bi-directional date.
It's bi-directional, and then on top of that as well, it is using obviously the DUW3001 as its base, but it only adds 0.4 mm in terms of thickness. So its movement inside of here is 3.6 mm in terms of thickness as opposed to 3.2. So that results in a watch that's just under 8 mm in terms of thickness. So even though the watch is 41 mm in terms of diameter, it's only 7.9 mm in terms of thickness, and it makes it so wearable on a large variety of wrists, right?
So I think the case for this is this new updated 41 Neomatik Tangent. It's 40.5 mm, and I think the new movement they use to include this bi-directional date wheel with the 0.5 mm thickness is DUW6101 caliber.
And you can see that movement here. When you take the watch off, it's got a really beautiful sapphire case back, and you can see that actually it's finished super well. Right? I mean, it's an industrial movement, and I don't think it's trying to hide any of that. But for an industrial movement, it's really well done. I love the use of the full traversing balance bridge, as I said, which creates a very, very stable balance wheel, and also the use of the blue screws. Beautiful rhodium treatment to the base plate.
I think one thing I will point out is, for German industrial design, like movement like Nomos, I actually prefer it more over than the Swiss industrial counterpart, because of all these beautiful blue screws, finishing and all that. I think it just takes the cake for me for industrial design. I think this is a great one.
It's remarkably well done, honestly. So why do we call this watch resilience? So this is one of the qualities I admire most. And what is resilience? It's the capacity that in the face of trauma or pressure to survive, adapt, and grow, right? And I think that after the crazy pandemic that we've all been through, or even just through our personal lives, I've always thought that resilience is an extraordinary thing. Now, sometimes I think about like cities as having expressions of certain qualities, and when I think about resilience, I think about Berlin and I think about Glashutte, right? Berlin, as you know, was under Soviet rule for decades and only reunified after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. And so much of Glashutte had to be rebuilt after the Second World War, and so much of it was deeply, deeply oppressed during Soviet rule as well. One of the interesting byproducts of this was that, like, because all of the factories, including Lange, including all the historic factories, were nationalized into one big watch company called the GUB, which served the needs of the Soviet Union. The Eastern Bloc countries were never affected by the quartz crisis because quartz was considered to be like like Western innovation and viewed with suspicion. So throughout this entire period where like Switzerland was getting hammered by this quartz crisis, mechanical watchmaking just continued in East Germany.
Wow, I didn't know about that actually. That's interesting.
And so that's why in the early 90s, when people rushed back to Glashutte, there was so much capability there with mechanical watchmaking. That's why he was able to move back to Glashutte and create his first series of watches in 1991 because of the technical know-how. Now today, you should know that Nomos is an absolute juggernaut. It occupies over 300 people. It has this incredible office that used to be a train station in Glashutte. And I think in terms of volume, it produces the greatest amount of watches in Glashutte. We came up with the idea that resilience would be a great theme for the watch that we did together. It was about how do we symbolize that on the watch, right? You don't want to just write resilience across it or whatever. So I have a friend named Emma Vogler that lives in Berlin. She's both a fashion model and also a trained paramedic. So I've always joked that like when she's riding around the ambulance and she's resuscitating people, they are actually going to think that they've died and gone to heaven. But nonetheless, she loves these kind of like ideas. And so we were having a drink with Martina Etti from Nomos, and she said, well, do you know that the symbol in nature for resilience is the helix?
Okay.
So if you look at like a seashell, for example, the helix or the nautilus that it forms is a symbol for resilience, because anytime pressure is exerted on the shell, it forms a spiral to protect itself. Same thing with a plant root. When it hits an obstacle, it forms like a helix around it, right? And she said, and do you further know that actually the helix, the shape of the helix follows the Fibonacci sequence, right? Which is this famous mathematical sequence that was initially discovered in 200 BC by a Sanskrit poet / mathematician named Pingala. And now today we consider it to be associated with Fibonacci, right? The famous Leonardo da Pisa, which is a mathematician from Italy. And that incredible mathematical sequence is something that you see in nature all the time. And we were like, well, I guess we could insert the sequence into the minute track of the watch, and eventually went in with this watch. So this is the Nomos Neomatik Tangente Update 41 Resilience, because it has the Fibonacci sequence very subtly integrated into the minute track. And I think that it's a really cool watch because when I understand the culture of Nomos, when I understand the history of both Berlin and Glashutte, it kind of makes me think about how much I admire the quality of resilience. So when you have this watch on your wrist, no matter what happens to you, the motto is you're going to survive, adapt, and grow, right?
That's really cool. Wow. I mean, it's the touches are so subtle. You cannot really see it, but you can only really appreciate it when you see it in the flesh.
Well, I guess that's the cool thing about it. Like with all things Nomos, it had to be subtly integrated, right? So, but it's there, and like it'll be funny because like people will look at the watch and be like, "Why there's just a certain random scattering of minute markers here?" And you can just tell them eventually that well, it's a Fibonacci sequence, and that, my friend, is a symbol for resilience. So, Constant, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you guys for joining us as well.
Everyone.
If this watch speaks to you, we'll be creating it in a series of 55 watches, 30 to be sold by Revolution and 25 to be sold by Nomos. Hit us up if you're interested. Thank you. Cheers, bro.